Where's your thing, kid? What the hell are you doing?
Don't look at me!
"Where's your thing, boy?" the rancher asked, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the young hand waist deep in the river. Sun in August was aflame, melting the desert, the wind a shrill warning whistling through crisp, dry bushes. And then he saw her. In the cool water, a slender figure was bathing. It was Jessie, but not the Jessie he knew. The wide-brimmed hat lay discarded on a smooth stone, revealing a cascade of wet, black hair. The coarse, flannel shirt he had seen her wear daily was gone, exposing smooth skin, old bruises, and the unmistakable curves of a woman's breasts. He couldn't contain his rage. "Where's your manhood, kid?" Then he said, "What the hell are you doing?" His voice, rough and hoarse, tore through the stillness. Jessie jumped, her head snapping up, eyes wide with fear. "No!" she screamed, a sound that shredded the air, a cry of despair and humiliation. She wailed, "Don't look at me!" Her whole body trembled as she awkwardly tried to shield herself with her arms. Her anguish was a sharp knife plunging straight into his heart. If you love love stories set amidst the hardships and storms of the Wild West, comment 1 and your location. Then, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Wild West Love. Ethan Whitaker stood by the corral fence, his rough hands clenched around a shovel, his eyes scanning the faded grass. It had been a long time since he'd seen anything new on this land. The life of a widowed, solitary man was just work and silence, but one morning a shadow appeared. It wasn't a dust storm or horse thieves, but a strange young man. He didn't come looking for work. He came like an accident, an unspoken question. His presence was like a crack in the solid rock of Ethan's life, and he knew it would soon shatter. The whinny of a horse startled Ethan. He rushed to the stable, thinking one of them was hurt. But no, it was the strange young man, hastily trying to tie up a rein. He wore a baggy shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that hid most of his face. He was thin, his body trembling, but his hands were quick and skillful. Ethan blocked the stable door. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. The young man jumped, turning quickly. His eyes darted past Ethan and then down to the ground, not daring to look straight at him. Ethan could only see his pointy chin and chapped lips. "I'm just passing through, mister," he said, his voice hoarse and shaky. Ethan frowned. "I don't see your horse, and people who are just passing through don't usually sneak into other people's stables." He looked at the hands the young man was trying to hide. The fingers were thin but strangely calloused, and there was a small scar near his wrist. The young man stepped back, like a cornered animal. "I'm sorry. I just wanted a drink of water." "You're lying," Ethan said, a single, cold word. "What are you doing here? Who are you running from?" The young man looked up, and Ethan saw a look of panic, but also of determination. "I'm not running from anyone," he said, his voice regaining a bit of calm. "I'm looking for work." Ethan gave a bitter laugh. All runaways say that. But he saw a different glint in the young man's eyes, a rare resilience and self-respect. "What's your name?" "Juniper." "Juniper," Ethan repeated, as if to remember the strange name. He looked him up and down, then unexpectedly tossed the shovel he was holding toward him. "Get to work." Juniper picked up the shovel, his eyes full of gratitude. He didn't ask any more questions, just started working. He worked as if there were no tomorrow, as if labor was the only way for him to forget the fear hidden in his soul. Jebediah, a garrulous old cowboy, was immediately annoyed. He looked at Juniper with a scrutinizing eye, and then turned to gossip with someone else. "That kid is strange. I bet he's hiding a secret." At night, Juniper sat quietly in his tent. The fear was still there, but there was a little hope. She knew she had fooled the rancher. Ethan Whitaker was a silent man, but he wasn't a bad man. Still, she couldn't sleep, because the image of her ex-husband Roderick kept coming back to her, and his voice was like a curse. "I'll find you, no matter where you hide." Ethan stood on the porch, looking toward Juniper's tent. He didn't trust the young man, but he couldn't hate him either. The curiosity in him had awakened a part of himself he had buried long ago, a protective instinct. He felt that something was wrong about the strange young man, a dark secret that could swallow his entire ranch. But at the same time, he also felt an invisible thread pulling him toward him. The heavy silence of the Whitaker ranch was a part of Ethan's life. It was the armor he wore, the wall he built. The dust of the ranch settled behind him like a forgotten memory. But the disappointment of the day felt like a tight knot in his chest. He rode his horse to the only place he found real solace, a secluded bend on the North Fork of the Powder River. The water here was clear and cold, winding through a narrow gorge, hidden from prying eyes. It was his sanctuary, where the burden of his losses, the gnawing of his loneliness, seemed to lighten. He dismounted and tied his horse to a cottonwood tree. His boots crunched on the fallen leaves, and he took a deep breath, letting the familiar smell of damp earth and pine needles fill his lungs. As he neared the water's edge, a fleeting movement caught his eye. Instinctively, his hand went to the Colt on his hip. He moved stealthily, the predator's instinct honed by years of living on the edge of civilization. He peered through the thick willows, his breath catching in his throat, and then he saw her. In the cool water, a slender figure was bathing. It was Jessie, but not the Jessie he knew. The wide-brimmed hat lay discarded on a smooth stone, revealing a cascade of wet black hair. The coarse, flannel shirt he had seen her wear daily was gone, exposing smooth skin, old bruises, and the unmistakable curves of a woman's breasts. Ethan stood still. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image before him with the thin, modest farmhand who had arrived a few weeks ago. His whole world seemed to shatter. This was not just a farmhand, this was a woman, a deception, living under his roof, working beside him, fooling him all this time. A hot, bitter betrayal flooded his entire being. Ethan froze. The image before him rooted him to the spot like a blow to the chest that knocked the air clean out of his lungs. Time stopped. The sound of the river, the wind in the trees, the creak of the saddle leather behind him all faded into a muffled silence. She stood waist-deep in the cool bend of the river, water gliding over her skin like glass over stone. Her back was to him, arms reaching up to wring out her wet hair, black and slick against her shoulders. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods above, catching the droplets sliding down her spine, lighting her skin in a soft gold that made her seem almost ethereal. Her figure, unmistakably feminine, broke every assumption he had built over weeks of labor and silence. Juniper. The hat was there, hers tossed on a nearby rock like it never meant a damn thing. The same hat she never took off, not once, not even in the blazing heat. The baggy shirt, the thick flannel, the clumsy gait gone. In their place was the truth, unhidden and vulnerable. And the bruises, faint and faded, but there, purple, yellow, some healed, some newer. He counted 3 before he had to look away. His mouth went dry. He backed a step, but his boot crunched a dry leaf. Juniper turned halfway at the sound, and in that brief second before she saw him, Ethan saw her face in the light, soft and bare. Her eyes were closed. For once, she wasn't afraid. For once, she wasn't hiding. Then she saw him, but Ethan couldn't move, couldn't turn away. The shock wasn't just at the truth, it was at what it did to him. The guilt crawled up his spine. Shame followed close behind. He felt the heat rising in his chest, not the fire of lust, no, but something more confusing, more violent. Betrayal. This woman had been living under his roof, eating at his table, working his land. She had let him think she was a boy, let him trust her, let him protect her. But what burned hottest wasn't just that she had lied, it was that he hadn't seen it, that he'd missed it. All of it, the softness in her voice, the way she moved when she thought no one was looking, the way she kept her distance not out of rudeness, but fear. He felt like a fool. Worse than a fool, he felt violated. And beneath that, something darker stirred an anger not just at her, but at himself. Because somewhere deep inside, even before this moment, he had known, or at least, he had wondered. The way his eyes lingered on her, the way he found excuses to pass by the stable when she was working, The protective instinct he had chalked up to simple decency, was it ever just that? He clenched his jaw, trying to breathe through the hurricane in his head. Part of him wanted to walk away, ride back, pretend none of this had happened. But he couldn't, because now he knew, and with that knowing came responsibility, questions, rage. He stepped forward again, his fists tightening at his sides. His boot hit a root, snapping it loud enough to startle her. She turned fully, gasping when she saw him, her eyes wide, arms crossing her chest in a panic. Her mouth opened in a silent cry. Her entire body trembled. That was when the floodgate inside him burst. He couldn't contain his rage. "Where's your manhood, kid?" Then he said, "What the hell are you doing?" His voice, rough and hoarse, tore through the stillness. Jessie jumped, her head snapping up, eyes wide with fear. "No!" she screamed. A sound that shredded the air, a cry of despair and humiliation. She wailed, "Don't look at me." Her whole body trembled as she awkwardly tried to shield herself with her arms. Her anguish was a sharp knife plunging straight into his heart. Ethan's rage died down, replaced by a fierce wave of emotion. He saw the utter shame, pain, and fear in her eyes. "Why did you have to do that?" he asked again, his voice much softer. "It wasn't a joke, mister," Juniper said, her voice trembling but firm. "It was survival." She choked up. "What did you think I was going to do? Walk into your ranch as a woman, looking for work? What would that get me? A steady job or exploitation?" Her anguish was a punch to his chest. He had once believed that his pain of loss was the greatest pain in the world. But Juniper's pain, the pain of a woman who had to deny her own identity to survive, was 100 times more painful. He looked at the scars on her shoulders, the bruises on her arms, and he understood. He understood why she was so afraid, why she had to disguise herself. Her anguish was a punch to his chest. Ethan didn't say a word. He walked over and embraced her trembling body. He held her so tightly that she could barely breathe, and he kissed her. His anger, her shame, his understanding, and her confusion all merged into one. But immediately, another feeling arose in Juniper. The kiss was not a safety. It was an ownership, a reminder of what she had endured. Her tears began to fall, not from emotion, but from extreme fear. She struggled, pushing him away desperately. She screamed, a shriek that ripped through the peaceful air, a cry of humiliation and pain. "Don't touch me!" she yelled. Then she turned her back and ran like a wounded animal, without looking back. Ethan stood there, stunned, watching her disappear into the dry bushes. He had broken the wall she had built, but not with trust, but with a spontaneous act. He had made her more afraid than ever. The following days, a heavy silence fell over the ranch. Juniper returned to work, but she once again hid behind her wide hat in silence. She no longer looked Ethan in the eye. Whenever he came near, she would step back, like a wary deer. Ethan tried to fix his mistake. He left a plate of toast on her workbench. She just ate it silently, without saying a word of thanks. One afternoon, he saw her sitting alone by the fire, her eyes staring into space. He sat down near her, keeping a safe distance. "I'm sorry," he said. "I couldn't control myself." Juniper didn't answer. She just looked into the fire. For a moment, Ethan thought she would leave. But then, she suddenly asked, "Why did you kiss me?" Ethan was surprised. It was a fragile opening. "I don't know," he said, his voice warm. "I thought it was what you needed." Juniper gave a bitter laugh, a bitter smile. No one kisses a woman who's been beaten. They just beat her. Then, she got up and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the flickering fire. It wasn't the peace of solitude, but a silence full of cracks, like a thin layer of ice on a cold lake, just waiting for a small impact to shatter. Ethan worked like a ghost, his hand clenched around the hoe, but his mind clung to the image of the one who had run away. The kiss, instead of being a bridge, became a wall. It was not a salvation, but a violation, a painful reminder of what Juniper had endured, and her silence, like a silent sandstorm, was slowly pulling him in. Something was bothering Ethan. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Juniper, on the other hand, was an ice block. She accepted the gifts, but never looked him in the eye. Her eyes, like a broken mirror, reflected fear and suspicion. Every time he got close, she would take a step back. Her fear, like a coiled snake in her stomach, had become more aggressive than ever. She was even afraid of Ethan's concern. That concern was a luxury she didn't believe she deserved. A sweet trap she was all too familiar with. She was afraid of men and wasn't ready to open her heart. The first month at the Whitaker Ranch passed like a sad song, with only the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of the wooden house and the sound of plowing the dry soil. Ethan, with his taciturn nature, maintained an invisible distance from Juniper. He watched her work, his eyes like two lanterns in the night, illuminating her every action. Juniper, on the other hand, lived like a shadow. She ate in silence, slept in silence, and worked in silence. Her fear was not a scream, but an emptiness, a deep abyss that no one dared to touch. The suspicion in Ethan never completely disappeared. He still wondered where she came from, why she had to disguise herself as a man, and why her eyes were always full of caution. But gradually, that suspicion gave way to another emotion, one he had buried for a long time: curiosity and compassion. It was like a seed silently sprouting on the dry land of his soul. One afternoon, one of his young horses hurt its leg. Ethan and Juniper had to bandage it together. He carefully held the horse's leg, while she held it still. When Juniper bent down, her faded shirt slipped down a bit, revealing an old scar on her shoulder. The scar was not from an accident, but a long, ugly scar, as if a knife had once cut through her flesh. It was like a silent language, telling a story of pain that Ethan could not understand. For a moment, Ethan was stunned. He looked at the scar, and he felt a shock run down his spine. It was not the mark of courage, but the mark of abuse, of cruelty. Juniper immediately pulled her shirt up, hiding the scar as if it were a disgusting secret. She didn't look him in the eye, her face flushed with shame and humiliation. Her fear was not the fear of being caught, but the fear of being judged, of being despised. Ethan didn't say a word. He just silently bandaged the horse, but his mind clung to that scar. He had seen scars like that on the bodies of beaten women in distant towns. It was not just a physical wound, but a wound of the soul, of self-respect. In that moment, the suspicion in him completely disappeared, giving way to deep empathy. He no longer saw Juniper as a deceiver, but as a wounded deer trying to run from a wolf. From that day on, Ethan's attitude toward Juniper changed. He still kept a certain distance, but not because of suspicion, but because of respect. He didn't ask about the scar, because he knew that there were some stories that could not be told in words. He only showed his concern through small, meaningful actions. He fixed her tent, mending the holes in the fabric. He left a plate of toast and a cup of hot milk on the table before she woke up. Those actions, without words, were enough for Juniper to understand that she was no longer a runaway, but someone who was loved and respected. After the rainy days, a fragile bond was established between Ethan and Juniper. His silent protection and her cautious trust, like two dry branches, had begun to sprout. Juniper no longer avoided his gaze, and Ethan, in his awkwardness, began to talk to her more, asking about the small things of the day. She felt a safety she had never had before. One afternoon, Ethan and Juniper went down to town to sell some cows. While Ethan was talking to a buyer, Juniper stood in a hidden corner, waiting. She overheard the conversation of two old men, one the general store owner, the other a familiar neighbor of Ethan's power general store owner. "That Ethan, you have to admit he's good," the store owner said, his voice full of admiration mixed with a little annoyance. "He has the biggest ranch in this area, built it all by himself." The neighbor nodded in agreement, but his voice was sarcastic. "Talented, yes, but also the most arrogant and difficult guy. He's refused so many matchmaking offers. Every woman is afraid of him. He just needs to be alone." The store owner sighed, looking toward Ethan. "He's like a lonely king, in his own kingdom. He's not the kind of person who can empathize with the miserable. Maybe he just kept that kid to have unpaid labor." Those words, like an ice knife, pierced through the safe shell Juniper was trying to build. Miserable lives, that was how the world had always seen her. And Ethan, the man she had begun to trust, was no different. She thought that his kindness was not a sincere feeling, but an arrogance, a satisfaction of the ego of a successful man who could save a miserable person. He didn't want her. He just wanted control. Juniper immediately backed away, hiding in a corner. When Ethan came back, she just silently followed him, without saying a word. Her eyes returned to a cold, distant look. The fragile smile was gone. Ethan, sensing this sudden change, tried to ask her, but she just shook her head. When they returned to the ranch, Juniper no longer slept in her tent, but went back to the barn. She worked like a machine, without rest, as if she wanted to punish herself for being stupid enough to trust. Her fear now was not just that of a runaway woman, but the fear of becoming a plaything of an arrogant man again. Juniper, in her fear and suspicion, had begun to realize the difference in Ethan. Her fear was a wild horse, cornered, always ready to run. But Ethan's gentleness, like a patient hand, was slowly stroking it, calming it down. One night, a sudden storm hit, and a loud clap of thunder struck right next to the ranch. Ethan immediately ran to Juniper's tent. He found her huddled in a corner, her whole body trembling. The thunder was not just the sound of nature, but it was the voice of the past, the screams, the insults. Ethan gently sat down next to her and held her in his arms. He just sat there, quietly, like a solid rock in the middle of a storm. He wrapped his coat around her, and he waited for her to fall asleep before he left. Juniper, in her fear and suspicion, had begun to realize the difference in Ethan. Her fear was a wild horse, cornered, always ready to run, but Ethan's gentleness, like a patient hand, was slowly stroking it, calming it down. She no longer felt like just a farmhand, but someone who was protected, who was cherished. That fragile bond, like a thin thread between two abysses, was created from empathy and vulnerability. Just as the young shoots tentatively poked through the ground, the storm hit again. One afternoon, as the sun was setting in the west, a large cloud of dust appeared at the end of the road, signaling the arrival of a group of people. The sound of hooves was heavy on the dry ground. Ethan stood on the porch, his hand clenched around the pistol on his hip. He was not afraid, but he felt a cold tension spread through his body. He knew this day would come. Juniper, who was washing clothes in the backyard, also heard the sound of hooves. Her heart pounded, a primal and extreme fear rising in her heart. She knew that the sound of those hooves was not from passers-by, but the hooves of the past, of the obsession named Roderick. She rushed out, her face pale. The group of men stopped in front of the ranch gate. A cowboy, with a full beard, stepped forward. He was not Roderick, but his voice was condescending. "Little girl," he said, smirking, "we're here to take you home." Juniper took a deep breath. Her fear, like a small flame, no longer burned her, but had turned into a torch. She stepped out, not backing away, not hiding. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice stronger than she thought. "I don't belong to you." The cowboy laughed loudly. "Don't belong to us? You're the boss's wife. You're a piece of property that ran away." "I'm not a piece of property," Juniper said. She stood up straight, facing him. "I'm a human being, and I'm not anyone's wife." Those words, like a knife, stabbed right into his arrogance. He took a step forward, intending to raise his hand. Ethan, who was standing behind Juniper, quickly stepped forward, placing his hand on his gun. A tense electricity ran through the air. "Back off," Ethan said, his voice deep and authoritative. "This is my ranch." The cowboy looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing a cold and unwavering determination. He hesitated, and then another voice spoke from behind. "Leave it, Jim. She needs a lesson, not a fight." Roderick stepped out. He wasn't angry, but he had a dangerous smile. He walked closer, looking straight at Juniper. "Did you think I didn't know you were here, Juniper?" he said, his voice low but full of menace. "Did you think you could run away, and I would leave you alone?" He looked at Ethan, his eyes full of contempt. "Saving a runaway whore, is that a brave act, or a foolish one, mister?" Juniper felt a chill run down her spine. The fear that had once controlled her had returned, but when she turned around, she saw Ethan standing there, unwavering. He was not a hero in a fairy tale, but an ordinary man, using all his strength to protect her. "I'm not a whore," Juniper said, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm a free woman." Roderick laughed loudly. "Free? You don't know what free is, Juniper. Free is being with me, eating well and dressing well. Otherwise, you'll live a miserable life. You'll die," Ethan said, his voice calm but full of threat. "She said she doesn't want to go with you, and she's not going." Roderick looked into Ethan's eyes, and he understood that he was not afraid. He looked at Juniper, and he saw a fire burning in her eyes, a fire he had not been able to extinguish. He knew that he no longer had control over her. "You'll regret this," Roderick said, his voice full of spite. "You'll pay the price. Both of you will pay the price." He turned his back, got on his horse, and with his group, galloped away. The silhouettes of Roderick's horses and his men disappeared at the end of the road, leaving only a thin layer of dust that gradually dissolved in the wind. The silence returned, but it was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battle that had just ended. Ethan still stood there, the gun in his hand, his eyes still following the direction they had gone. Juniper, standing behind him, felt her whole body go limp. She had bravely faced the past, but now, the fear she had suppressed for so long had exploded. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, not because she was weak, but because she was so tired. She no longer felt strong, only trembling. She turned around, her shoulders shaking, her body like a dry leaf in a storm, swaying and weak. She couldn't hold on any longer. Everything had shattered. She had stood up, but the price was the breaking of the shell she had tried to build for so long. The following days, a miraculous change took place on the Whitaker ranch. Juniper no longer hid behind her wide-brimmed hat. She had shed the shell she had built for so long. She still worked, but not like a machine, but like a woman. She did lighter work, like tending the vegetable garden, cooking, and mending clothes. Ethan didn't say anything, but he did the heavier work to share the burden with her. He had learned to talk to her, asking about the small things of the day. He had learned to smile, a smile that hadn't appeared on his lips for a very long time. Juniper also started talking to the others on the ranch. Jebediah, the garrulous old cowboy, was initially still suspicious, but after witnessing Juniper's courage, he changed his attitude. He told the others, "That kid is not a kid. She's the strongest woman I've ever seen." The other farmhands also changed their view of her. They no longer looked at her with curiosity or suspicion, but with respect. Juniper was no longer that kid Juniper. She had become Juniper. Winter came, bringing with it biting winds and the first snowfalls. The cold was no longer the loneliness Ethan was so used to, but a calmness, because he had Juniper. His ranch, once a cold fortress, was now warmed by her laughter, by the hot food she prepared over the fire, and by the gentleness she brought. Ethan, once taciturn and reticent, now knew how to be caring. He no longer just toiled in the fields, but also took time for the small things in the house. He fixed the leaky window so the wind wouldn't blow into Juniper's room, and he got extra dry firewood to keep the stove warm. He knew she liked wildflowers, so every morning he would bring back a small bouquet, quietly placing it on her workbench. Those actions, without words, were enough for Juniper to understand that she was no longer a runaway, but someone who was loved, who was cherished. Juniper was the same. She had blown a new wind into the ranch. Meals were no longer monotonous, but delicious food, decorated with a wildflower branch. She mended Ethan's torn shirts, sewed on the missing buttons, and she embroidered small images on them, horses, flowers. The ranch was now not just a place to work, but a home. One early spring day, when the young shoots began to sprout on the dry branches, a stranger appeared at the ranch. It was a mailman, carrying a letter from Sarah, her sister. Sarah wrote that she had heard about a group of men looking for Juniper, and that they were getting close to town. "He's threatening to teach Ethan a lesson," Sarah wrote, "and I'm afraid they won't stop." Juniper read the letter, and her whole world seemed to collapse under her feet. She felt breathless, as if the air in the room had been sucked out. She looked out the window, where Ethan was working in the field, and she knew she couldn't drag him into this fight. She had brought him enough trouble, and she couldn't let him pay the price for her. She decided to leave. She wrote a short letter to Ethan, thanking him for everything he had done, and saying that she had to go to protect him, to protect the ranch. She packed a few clothes, took a horse, and left in the night, when the moonlight was obscured by thick clouds. But Ethan was not a person to let her go so easily. When he found the letter the next morning, he immediately got on his horse and chased after her. He didn't know exactly where she had gone, but he knew she wouldn't go far without leaving a trace. He found her in the afternoon, as she was resting by a small stream, a few miles from the ranch. "You can't just keep running," Ethan said, his voice both angry and pained. "Do you think leaving will solve everything? Do you think I'll let you face all of this alone?" Juniper looked at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want you to get hurt," she said, her voice choked. "Roderick won't stop. He'll destroy everything, and I can't let you become a victim." Ethan walked closer to her, took her by the shoulders, his eyes burning. "I'm not a victim, Juniper, and neither are you. We'll face this, together." Juniper pulled back the kitchen curtain, the late afternoon sunlight dancing across the old shed roof, where Ethan was patching the tin with a piece he'd scavenged. The early spring wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and birdsong, easing the tightness in her chest. Life on the ranch wasn't easy, but it had rhythm, a slow, steady rhythm, like the breath of someone who had learned to live with loss and keep going. Ethan stepped inside, wiping his hands on his jeans before turning on the tap. "Roof's patched. You save any of that cornbread from yesterday?" "In the oven," Juniper replied, turning to pour 2 cups of hot tea. "I added honey." They sat at the small kitchen table, not saying much. Both were used to long days of work, and they didn't need big conversations to fill the quiet. The breeze through the window, the soft clink of utensils, the low hum of the wood stove, that was enough. "Thinking about planting more beans this season," Ethan said. "Tomatoes didn't stand up to June heat last year." Juniper nodded. "I'll rework the garden bed. Soil needs turning." That was how they talked. Practical, honest, no fluff. But in every exchange was a quiet care, like the way Ethan always gave Juniper the larger portion at dinner, or how she made sure coffee was brewed before he went out to the barn. That afternoon, they went down to the creek behind the house to rinse vegetables. Juniper rolled up her pants, standing ankle-deep in the icy water, washing fresh greens. Ethan stood nearby holding the basket, eyes following the current, lost in thought. "Today makes 1 year since I came here," Juniper said softly. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know. I haven't forgotten." They didn't need to revisit the details of that day. No need to recall why Juniper had shown up at his gate, dusty and holding tight to an old canvas bag. But both remembered, and both knew they'd changed since. "Back then, I thought I'd only stay a few days. Just find a place to catch my breath and keep moving," she said, still rinsing. "But you stayed," Ethan finished. "And I'm glad you did." A breeze picked up, brushing her hair across her face. Ethan reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. Their eyes met a quiet moment, deep and still. No kiss, no declarations. That evening, after a simple dinner of bean stew and cornbread, Juniper tidied the kitchen, while Ethan wrestled with the stuck drawer in the cupboard. The sounds of sawing and clinking utensils wove together into a simple domestic melody. "Thinking of stopping by Mrs. Callahan's tomorrow to pick up some seeds," Juniper said. "She says she's got a new kind of pumpkin that's pest-resistant. Go early before the sun gets too hot. I can go with you if you want." She smiled. "I know, but you've still got the cowshed to finish. I'll be fine on my own." Their eyes met in mutual understanding. Trust was something built over early mornings brewing coffee together, shared sunsets, and quiet nights listening to rain on the tin roof. Juniper had once thought love only arrived with stormy passion, in grand gestures or wild kisses during chaos. But here, she'd learned love could also be a pair of boots left side by side on the porch, a hand held in silence as they walked through wheat fields, promises spoken without word. A week later, Ethan built Juniper a small greenhouse. "So the veggies don't freeze in winter," he said. Juniper didn't say anything at first, just stepped forward and hugged him from behind. It was the first time she'd done that. Ethan was surprised, but he didn't turn around. He just reached back and held her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Never thought I'd live like this," he said. "Quiet. Same every day. But with you, it feels like enough." Juniper rested her cheek against his back. "Same here. I used to think I didn't belong anywhere. But now, each morning I wake up, I know I'm home." There were no wedding rings, no ceremony, but their love was realer than any ritual. And it was enough to teach two once broken people, full of doubt and fear, how to stay and how to grow. Summer arrived slowly, with long, warm evenings and the hum of crickets rising from the grass. Juniper began spending more time in the greenhouse, carefully labeling rows of basil, lettuce, and squash. Ethan carved new fence posts from cedar, the scent sharp and grounding. They fell into a new rhythm, Ethan rising before dawn, Juniper bringing him breakfast on the fence line. She packed him lunch, and he left notes folded into the napkins. Little things. A sketch of a flower, a line from a poem. "Your smile was the first piece I found." One Sunday, they took the wagon into town. Not for supplies, but for the church picnic by the river. Juniper wore a blue cotton dress Ethan hadn't seen before. He didn't say anything, but he couldn't stop looking at her. She noticed. "It's just a dress," she said, teasing. "It's not the dress," Ethan replied. "It's you in it." They sat on a blanket, watching children run through the shallows, while neighbors passed around lemonade and peach pie. For a moment, it felt like nothing had ever gone wrong, like they'd always been here, laughing beside the water. After the sun dipped low and the wagon creaked homeward over gravel roads, Juniper leaned against Ethan's shoulder and whispered, "This feels like a memory we'll tell someday." Ethan placed his hand over hers. "I think it already is." That night, as they lay in bed listening to owls call from the woods, Juniper turned to him, her voice barely audible. "What if one day I leave again? Not because I want to, just what if?" Ethan looked at her, eyes steady. "Then I'll come find you. Again and again, if I have to." Juniper didn't cry, but she kissed him then, softly, like a promise. And this time, there were no ghosts in the room, just the future, waiting quietly outside the door.